Welcome to Underground Philosophy. Our session today is titled Science and Magic. We've had a couple sessions on this in the network, or one session and then an alchemizing consciousness. And I've done, as usual, a bit of writing in preparation, but there's a lot here for this one. So I feel a certain weight of wanting to share a fair bit, actually, to orient us. At the same time, we want to make as much time for dialogue together as possible. And in that context, we can really take it wherever we like, wherever feels on the pulse of what our own understanding calls for, what the search for that understanding calls for. So, hopefully that sounds okay. Beginning with the etymology, I think, for these concepts is interesting. I would say that a fair bit of the understanding that I've been attempting to cultivate does rest a fair bit on what the etymology of these words point to. Magic, its etymology means power, and science, its etymology means knowledge. More or less. Knowledge and power. And those two things seem appropriate to put together. But they're not the same thing. And we need to treat them quite carefully, I think. But how do we do that? Well, in that context, I think that wisdom makes sense to include, to fill out the triad. So these are some of the basic concepts that are orienting how I'm relating to the topic of science and magic, and I think which are helpful for us to orient together. Now, I want to share a little bit of how I at least attempt a philosophy of science and also a philosophy of magic. And in the attrition of that, we'll find quite a bit, I think, to work with. Magic is perhaps, well, I honestly, I think they're both as interesting as each other, but science in our time is something that's altogether a bit more sensible, a bit more trusted by what at least sits above the surface of authority in our time. Of course, magic belonging, one of those concepts at least that belongs to the occult, the less understood. But in principle, still tremendously influential. We also see it show up as a term, I think, really helpfully in a way that actually elucidates something profound about its meaning in everyday language when we might talk about athletes or art. I think about the best football players. I think about Lionel Messi. And you'll find that most people, when they describe Messi, they describe him as magic. And this capacity to not only play football, but to do it in a way that's magical. And I think why we reach for that word is illuminating. To me, it's a lot to do with opening systems, being on the pulse of that, which can open us into potential, where otherwise the game could be seen as shut. So I want to return to that, but I just leave that there as a note for now. So if we begin with science, welcome. So if we begin with science, really reducing it to a set of concepts that can help us move forward with maximum clarity is an interesting, challenging task. We can debate about it to some degree. Now, it seems to me a lot is to do with the capacity for observation or measurement. I see both of those as meaning very similar things, pointing to slightly different levels almost. So observation and measurement, and then repeatability. And then at the social level, we might think about science as almost a social, political, social, ecological practice. And there's an institution of science, a set of norms and ways to approach verifying whether or not the observations and measurements have been repeated appropriately or not. And in that context, there's a room for a whole bunch of criticism, which famously postmodernism and various schools of thinking throughout the 20th century will be pointing to a level of social political critique, which I think is really relevant, but isn't necessarily what I'm immediately focusing us on here. But measurability and repeatability. I've certainly been motivated by Forrest Landry describing science in this way over time, such a brilliant compressor of notions into really tight language. Now, in my book that's below me, there are a few elements I like to add into that. So maybe I'll read that out a little bit later. But for now, I think that's helpful. It's a certain approach to gaining knowledge. And people say, okay, maybe it comes about over the last few centuries. That's not the position I take. I think it's a natural fact almost of human beings, of anthropos, as we have known ourselves for millennia. Pushing it back further than that becomes interesting. I think there's something relevant there as well, although of course you're not going to have the same social institutional aspects. But certainly when it comes to observing patterns, being able to return with consistency to the observation of those patterns and to cultivate the kind of, again, habits, models, behaviors that support the ongoing observation and ultimately in participation in those patterns. Something, of course, that I think elements of science over the course of the last few centuries have lost a little bit of that sense of our being involved in the process. The sense that in just taking a third-person perspective, we can stand outside of deep dynamics, complexity, and know the world without perturbing it or moving it in some way. Now, of course, the more we're able to specify a domain, the more we're able to control so that our measurements are accurate according to what it is we're desiring to measure. Then we might say, well, we can stand outside of at least this domain of analysis and really come to understand what the cause and effect, why this is occurring and why another thing is following. And I think we have to keep that in mind, that the very act of doing that is tremendously, does produce a kind of knowledge that can be tremendously powerful. Is it wise? Can we come into a state of divorce, really, with the vitality of life and what's really influencing what makes possible, relationality or entanglement or life and these sorts of things to actually occur? That, for me, is a question which continues to return as soon as we start to get particularly confident in just how, strong and effective our knowledge systems are with respect to what they're naming. Okay. So I don't know. We could say a bunch of other things about the history of science and notions of, falsifiability and verification and these sorts of things, and they're all relevant. There's obviously a lot more to speak on. But magic is the part of this that I think is, well, why even speak about it? I know for most of us here, it's perhaps something we find to be fairly self-evident, that there's something intriguing, alluring, something real about it. Can you hear me okay, Les? Do I a bit louder? Would that help? Or Okay, I'll speak a bit louder. We'll see. Now, there are, I think, some interesting ways to approach how we bring magic into a process of understanding together. I'm going to begin with what is part of the popular zeitgeist. And I don't mean that critically, as in to be negative about it, but if there's a book below me called The Science of Magic by Dean Radin, who's one of the most famous credentialed scientists, in America, who explores parapsychological, otherwise psi phenomena with what attempts to be scientific rigor. And he has a very distinguished career. And he will articulate magic as having sort of three schools. And this isn't what I'm not asking us to consider this like this is what magic is. But when I read them, I thought these are helpful to demarcate how we can think about how magic shows up popularly. One is in the notion of enchantment. And by enchantment, he really just means psychokinesis. It means the utilization of intention to alter, in quotation marks, physical reality. So notions, again, popularly of such things as non-local consciousness speak to this a little bit. The sense that intention can, irrespective of distance and importantly, irrespective of what we can heretofore measure as being involved in the interaction, influence, apply a cause onto reality, manifest something, make something happen. So enchantment as to do with in a sense, the power of, through consciousness, manifesting in reality, influencing, again, material. We should notice immediately that we can't escape the fact that metaphysical assumptions are part of how we can even begin to frame this, or at least how the history of discourse is framing this. That is part of what I'm bringing to you as what is respectful in terms of engaging with popular conversation. I'm not wanting to come from a place that's wanting to, let's say, authenticate reasonable discussion on the basis of there being the kind of divide between the physical and the mental that is often, prescribed or described in various ways of thinking about philosophy of mind. You have physicalism, materialism, then you have dualism, idealism, as it's all mental, physicalism, all physical, right? Panpsychism is kind of all mental, but actually it's ensouled too. Consciousness is everywhere. Panpsychism, soul is a soul of, in how that is described at different levels. It's a cosmopsychism, right? Soul of the cosmos or planets. What constitutes the aggregation or the complex differences across levels regarding the composition of soul, the composition of mind or psyche into more complex variants is known as the combination problem in panpsychism, right? There's really no way to presence a lot of this stuff without naming all the various ways that, discourse has bitten off and is chewing on and is, far from smooth. Okay. So back to the three kinds of magic. Enchantment. The second is clairvoyance. This is where your sort of extrasensory perception, this is where it's not far sight, but it's far sight. It's that one way, remote viewing. That's the term I'm using, I'm looking for. Telepathy comes into this category. And the third that Radin speaks about, he uses the term theurgy for it, which is really to do with spirits, entities, and the kind of spiritual ritual practices associated with these sorts of things. Now, they are broad buckets, and it places magic already in a context that I don't find helpful enough to really grapple with and treat the meaning of it with as much integrity as it is calling me to. Anyway, and of course many others, and I'm sure most of us here, perhaps. One way to speak about why that is to do with how we participate in that which we do not fully understand, cannot yet name, but that in principle always eludes naming. The notion that, again, of coming to a sort of complete understanding, a science of magic that is finished, for me leaves no room whatsoever for magic, and in fact just is the process of cultivating and building our knowledge about how, in specified domains, we can notice patterns that repeat with sufficient reliability for us to be confident about. I suppose in our culture it's more or less been building technology that then we can build economic process on top of, or something like that. Now, there's almost certainly many more aspects to name there of what science has enabled, or that mode of knowledge acquisition enables. But if we go back to the example of football and Lionel Messi, as we are here on the day after, depending on where you live in the world, England have been knocked out of the World Cup. And I was sad about that. But here we are. And Lionel Messi did it. And I wasn't particularly interested in his magic today, but most of the time I am. And why? What is it about playing, being, participating in a certain way that brings the magic, that allows the magic, that allows quality, that allows something which unlocks potential to occur? A contender in the etymology of genius is something like being attended by a spirit. That there is a transmission that one receives, and that transmission and that receptivity is part of what supports the kind of expression that we'd see as genius. At least as a line of logic, to me this is suggestive of our capacity to unlock ourselves from the kind of formalizations and closures of system, which, I mean, in a sense, we can remain trapped in a game state being locked. Breaking open a defense is an interesting analogy, a way to look at it, I think. And so the approach to reality that looks to measure and quantify, order, formalize, so as to enable a kind of consistency within, again, a particular frame of reference, within a particular system of functioning, which I don't just mean to speak of cynically. There's a tremendous value to that. And then in, I think, a dyadic relation with that, being on the pulse of flow, of creativity, of the capacity to make that qualitative, attuned movement that is, as Les will often say, absolutely appropriate exquisitely appropriate to the moment, which is to say, maximally welcoming of the evolving context of ecology itself, and through that as a channel, having maximum flexibility to choose and participate in creativity. And in that regard, have tremendous influence in a way that is distinct from the preordained, pre-scripted cause and effect implementation of engineering technology that we'd associate as the byproduct of scientific mechanism. Now, I do like to think of technology in a way that's broader than just, again, tools that have been created through a narrowed view of science. You can think about technology also as technique and technologies of the psyche, of the body, right? And that technology is, in a sense, a part of nature as well. So there's lots here. And so if I attempt to bring this to a bit of a summation for the sake of, again, grounding some of the dialogue we can have together. Part of the motivation here for me is to really understand not how to pit science and magic against each other, or to, extol the virtues, the epistemic virtues of science to the detriment of magic, or to speak of science as lacking something so critical that may be approaching the world with a little bit more of a sense for the magical can enable. And we can also put art into a similar category, by the way. We can use different language here as well. But to really bring more and more into clarity, certainly for myself, but I hope in a way that is valuable, how these modes of reality, how we can cultivate knowledge about it, also how we can develop more of a sense of orientation for our power, a sense of orientation for the application of our knowledge. To stay open and to seek to, I think, really be able to welcome as much knowledge as we can in our grounding, in a sense, while at the same time doing so in a way that remains open to welcoming the beyond and being open to creativity, surprise, not being stuck. And what is it to really love science without falling to scientism is one way of looking at it. And how can we more deeply cultivate a relation with mystery and potential and creativity, and for all of the unknown that invokes, without trapping ourselves in something like an unconsciously held structure for understanding, which actually separates magic from vital creation, vital creativity, something like that. And if I leave one sort of archetypal mythological play to just be suggestive of what I mean there's something interesting at the level of wordplay about the archetype of the wizard and then of the warlock, where not that I've spoken much about wisdom, but that if we keep knowledge and power and wisdom in mind here as an interesting triad to play with, then the wizard is one who is at least, well, wise, is seeking to develop, cultivate wisdom along with the knowledge and power, where the warlock, again, a bit of word play, but, lock, to be locked in war, I think actually speaks quite interestingly to the kind of unconscious way that the utilization of power and the seeking of power can divorce itself from what really enables meaningful vitality, what really enables the light to shine through the cracks in a way that is nourishing. So there's more to say about those archetypes to play with. So that's been my attempt, speaking just a little longer today. I hope that was okay, of just providing some grounding, at least as I've been able to, while attempting to be technical where possible. And there's so much more, which I hope we can draw out. A lot of it can sound like a lot of words, almost as if I'm trying to fit all the words in some order so that, it's all there somewhere. And that kind of is it. You know what I mean? There is an attempt to weave them in a way that's actually in integrity. But the words are there. And if they seem like they've been, more or less paint thrown at a wall, then at least we have some paint.